The dish hit the table with a sound like a verdict. Marcella Ford stood at the entrance of the Redemption Creek Methodist Church, her hands empty, her heart hammering so loud she was certain every woman in that sunlit hall could hear it. She had forgotten. Or rather, she had been so consumed by grief and survival, and the sheer mechanical weight of existing alone in this territory that the potluck supper had slipped through the cracks of her mind like water through dry earth. And now here she stood, 30 years old, a widow of 7 months, staring at a long table that groaned under the weight of casserole dishes and cornbread pans and jars of preserved peaches, and she had nothing. Absolutely nothing to offer. Mrs. Hattie Prout set down a magnificent peach cobbler and looked at Marcella's empty hands with an expression that managed to be both pitying and satisfied at the same time. Ruth Ellen Graves was unwrapping a cloth from what smelled like sweet potato pie. Even young Clara Whitmore, who had only been married 3 months and could barely boil water without incident according to town gossip, had brought a full pot of chicken and dumplings that steamed warmly in the afternoon air. Every woman, every single woman had brought something except Marcella Ford. The betrayal she felt in that moment was not directed at them. It was directed at herself, at the life that had hollowed her out, at the dark past that followed her from Missouri like a second shadow. Her husband Thomas had been dead since January, thrown from his horse in a muddy ravine during the worst ice storm this part of Texas had seen in 20 years. And since then Marcella had simply been surviving, one gray day sliding into the next, the secret weight of grief pressing down on her lungs until breathing itself felt like an act of rebellion. She was about to turn and walk out. She had already begun the motion, her boot heel pivoting on the wooden floorboard when she saw him. Jasper Boone came through the side door of the church hall carrying 2 covered dishes. 2. One in each large, capable hand, the kind of hands that belonged to a man who worked land for a living and meant it. He was 34 years old with dark hair that needed cutting and honest brown eyes that swept the room with the particular alertness of a man who noticed things that other people preferred not to notice. He set both dishes on the table without ceremony, without announcement, and then he turned and his eyes found hers. And in that single moment Marcella Ford understood with a certainty that cracked something open in her chest that those 2 dishes had never been intended as a display of abundance. They had been brought for her. He had known she would forget, or perhaps he had simply feared it. Either way, Jasper Boone had brought 2 dishes to a church potluck, so that Marcella Ford would not stand empty-handed and ashamed before a room full of women who, however kindly they meant it, would spend the next 3 Sundays talking about nothing else. The room continued its cheerful noise around them. Plates rattled. Children were called back from the yard. Pastor Elias Holt said something jovial about the Lord's provision, but Marcella could not hear any of it properly because her blood was rushing too loud and her throat had gone tight with something she had not allowed herself to feel since the frozen morning they had pulled Thomas out of that ravine. Jasper crossed to her. He did not make a production of it. "I made extra," he said quietly. Figured my chili would keep better shared. It was such a careful, deliberate lie, so generous in its simplicity. And Marcella Ford, who had not cried in public once in 7 months of widowhood because she had been too busy being strong, felt her eyes sting with something fierce and immediate. "I forgot," she whispered. "I know," he said. And the way he said it held no judgment, no pity, nothing that would cost her dignity. Just 2 words that meant, "I see you and I am not going to let you fall." She had no way of knowing, standing there in that doorway with the smell of cornbread and the sound of a fiddle tuning up in the corner, that this moment was the beginning of the most defining season of her life. She had no way of knowing about the secrets Jasper Boone carried in his own chest, the dark past that had driven him to Redemption Creek in the first place, the forbidden feelings he had been locking down for 4 months with the rigid discipline of a man who believed he had forfeited the right to want things for himself. She had no way of knowing that before the Texas summer was finished, both of them would be forced to make choices that would cost them everything, and gain them more than they had ever dared to dream. But she would learn. And it would begin here, in this ordinary, sacred, ridiculous church hall, with a man who had brought 2 dishes of chili so a woman he admired would not have to feel small. Redemption Creek, Texas. Spring, 1884. The town had been carved out of the hard caliche earth with the kind of stubborn optimism that characterized every settlement in the post-war West. It sat on the edge of cattle country, close enough to the Balcones escarpment that the landscape had a dramatic quality to it. Limestone bluffs shouldering up out of flat grassland, cedar and live oak clustering along the creek bed that gave the town its name. The population was just over 400 souls, enough to sustain a general store, a blacksmith, a doctor who also pulled teeth, a small school, and the Methodist church that served as the community's social and spiritual anchor. Marcella had come to Redemption Creek 6 years ago as Thomas Ford's bride, having met him in Kansas City where he was purchasing cattle equipment and she was working as a seamstress's assistant. Thomas had been a good man, steady and plain-spoken, and Marcella had loved him in the way that practical people love one another, with gratitude and affection and genuine respect. They had built a small homestead on the creek's eastern branch, 40 acres of rocky but workable land, and for 5 years they had made something resembling a life there. Then the ice storm came. Thomas had ridden out to check on the cattle in weather that had no business carrying a man and had not come back. The hands had found him the next morning, the horse nowhere in sight, Thomas himself at the bottom of a steep-sided gully with his neck broken by the fall and the ice. After that, Marcella had simply existed. She sold 2 of the 4 cattle runs to pay down debt. She planted a modest kitchen garden. She repaired the fences herself, learning through broken blisters and the quiet instruction of their nearest neighbor, an elderly Mexican man named Don Agustin Reyes, who lived a mile down the creek and had been farming this land since before the war. She did not ask for help because asking felt like surrender, and surrender felt like dying, and Marcella was not yet ready to die. The town watched her with the complicated mixture of respect and worry that strong-willed widows always provoked. Mrs. Hattie Pruitt, who organized virtually all social events in Redemption Creek and whose opinion carried the weight of local law, had made it known that she thought Marcella needed to either remarry promptly or move back to whatever family she had in the East. Marcella had neither the inclination nor the family to satisfy either suggestion, so she went on being herself, which was apparently a sufficient provocation. Jasper Boone had arrived in Redemption Creek the previous October, which meant he had been in town for 7 months as of the Potluck Sunday. He had purchased the Callaway spread just north of the main road, a modest cattle operation with a farmhouse that needed significant work and about 200 head of longhorn. He was not loud about his history, which in 1884 was a perfectly acceptable form of autobiography. Men came west to start over, and it was considered low manners to press them on the subject of what they were starting over from. What people knew was observable. He was reliable. He showed up when there was communal work to be done, fence mending, barn raising, helping Don Agustin Reyes bring in his corn when the old man's back had flared up so badly he could not stand straight. He attended church every Sunday with the manner of a man who was genuinely engaged with the sermon rather than simply performing respectability. He was quiet in the best way, not sullen, not secretive in any threatening fashion, simply a man who believed that words were worth more when they were not depleted by careless use. Marcella had noticed him at church. Of course she had. The truth she allowed herself was that she had noticed him immediately, in the way that certain things announce themselves to the body before the mind has permission to process them. She had noticed the width of his shoulders and the careful way he removed his hat before entering the church, and the fact that he always stepped aside to let women and children pass through doorways first. She had also noticed, with the particular vigilance of a woman who had learned to read men carefully, that he never looked at her with that specific combination of sympathy and speculation that said he was calculating how soon a widow might be available. He looked at her as though she were simply a person worth looking at. This was rarer than it should have been. They had spoken 4 times before the potluck. Once in the general store, when both of them had reached for the last sack of cornmeal at the same moment, and he had withdrawn his hand immediately and said she should take it. Once after a Sunday service, when Pastor Holt had brought them together to discuss whether they might be willing to help coordinate the upcoming Easter celebration. Once when his fence had come down in a storm, and a small portion of his cattle had wandered onto her eastern pasture, and he had come to collect them with an apology that was so genuinely meant. She had found herself offering him water from her well, and spending 20 minutes talking about the unusual weather they'd been having. And once, on a cold February evening, when she had been driving her wagon back from town in the dark, and one of her wheel rims had cracked on a rock, and she was standing on the road trying to decide what could be done about it, and he had come along from the opposite direction, assessed the situation, and repaired the wheel with the tools he kept under his wagon seat without making it feel like rescue. Those 4 conversations had been enough. She admitted to herself in the private architecture of her own thoughts at night when the homestead was dark and quiet and honest, thoroughly aware of Jasper Boone in a way that frightened her, because it felt disloyal to Thomas and premature to herself, and generally inadvisable for a woman in her circumstances. She had pushed those thoughts down and covered them with work, and maintained her respectful distance with what she considered admirable discipline. And then the potluck happened. After Pastor Holt said the blessing over the food, and the hall filled with the comfortable noise of a community feeding itself, Jasper came to stand beside her in the supper line as naturally as though they had agreed to it. He did not make ceremony of it. He simply appeared at her elbow and handed her a bowl and said, "I have to confess, the chili is my grandmother's recipe, and I am more invested in your opinion of it than I am willing to admit in polite company." She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh coming up from somewhere she had thought was sealed. Not a polite laugh, not a social laugh, but a real one, sudden and brief and startlingly warm. "That is a great deal of pressure to put on a stranger," she said. "We are not strangers," he said, and there was something careful and deliberate about the way he said it, not forward, not presuming, just true. He was right. They were not strangers. She could not quite explain how that had happened across only 4 conversations, but it was accurate. They ate together at one of the long tables near the window, and Clara Whitmore's mother sat across from them and talked at great length about her sister's trouble with prairie dogs, which was both genuinely problematic and deeply unromantic, and which meant that the meal passed in completely unexceptional social territory. But there was a warmth in it, a comfortable ease that Marcella had not felt in so long she had nearly forgotten what it was called. When the supper was done and the tables were being cleared, Mrs. Prout found Marcella at the washing basin and said, in the carrying tone of a woman who has no idea she is being awful, "How fortunate that Mr. Boone had extra. We certainly would not have wanted the table to look incomplete." The words were designed to sting, and they did. But they also did something unexpected. They made Marcella angry, not the soft, apologetic anger she usually turned inward, but a hard, bright anger that felt uncomfortably close to life. She said, evenly and clearly, "Mr. Boone is a generous man, Mrs. Prout. The table was the better for it." Mrs. Prout's eyebrows rose approximately 1/4 inch, which in her particular emotional vocabulary signified surprise bordering on shock. She said something mollifying and moved away, and Marcella stood at the basin with her hands in the soapy water and thought that she needed to be very, very careful, because a man who brought 2 dishes so she would not feel small was a particular kind of dangerous. Not the violence kind, not the dark motive kind, not the kind that left bruises or spent your savings on whiskey. The kind that made you lower defenses you had spent months constructing. The kind that reminded you what it felt like to be seen. She was not sure she could afford to be seen yet. 3 days after the potluck, Jasper came to her door. He stood on her porch in the mid-morning light with his hat in his hands and an expression of such transparent honesty that she felt the familiar lurch in her chest before she even knew what he had come to say. He told her plainly that he had heard from Don Agustin that the fence along her northern pasture was in poor condition, and that he was planning to do some fencing work on his own property that week anyway, and would consider it no inconvenience to extend his work to her line if she was agreeable. He said it the way he said most things, directly, without embellishment, with no hidden motive visible on the surface. But Marcella had been alone for 7 months and had developed a certain hard-edged alertness about the difference between a man who wanted to help and a man who wanted to be owed. She studied him for a long moment. He met her eyes without flinching and without the particular gleam that accompanied an agenda. "I would need to pay you," she said. "No," he said. "You would not." "Then I would need to feed you," she said. "Lunch at minimum, that is non-negotiable." Something shifted in his expression. Not victory, not smugness. Just a kind of quiet pleasure that he seemed almost surprised to feel. "That seems fair," he said. He worked for 4 days on her northern fence. He was methodical and thorough, and he did not chatter while he worked, which she appreciated, because chattering men made her nervous in a way she could never fully articulate. On the first day, she brought lunch out to the fence line, cornbread and bean soup and a jar of cold water. They sat on the ground in the shade of a cedar tree and ate in a companionship that was comfortable in the way that old things are comfortable, which was strange considering how recently they had become whatever it was they were becoming. On the second day, she asked him where he was from. He was quiet for a moment. Not evasively quiet, but the kind of quiet that precedes honesty of the effortful variety. "Virginia originally," he said. "Then a few years in Tennessee. Then I moved around a good deal." "The war?" she asked. "Before, during, and after," he said. "I was a soldier. Union cavalry. My family was from the Shenandoah Valley, which made that choice unpopular in certain quarters." She understood the size of what he was describing without requiring the details. She had seen enough of what the war had done to families to know that a Union man from Virginia had not simply chosen a side. He had severed something fundamental and likely irrevocable. "Your family?" she asked. "Gone," he said, "one way or another." She did not press because she understood the geography of that word. Gone could mean dead. Gone could mean estranged. Gone could mean that the war had reached into ordinary life and rearranged it so thoroughly that nothing was where you had left it. "I came from Missouri," she said, offering something in return for his offering. "My father was a preacher, very certain about everything. I was considerably less certain, which made the household lively." He smiled at that. The smile did things to his face that she tried not to dwell on. "What made you come to Texas?" he asked. "Thomas," she said simply. "He was from here. He loved it here." She paused. "I understand why now, even if it took losing him to make me look at it properly." He was quiet for a moment that held respect in it. "You are staying?" he asked. "This is my land," she said. "Thomas is buried on it. I'm not going anywhere." Something in his expression settled, as though that answer had resolved a question he had not quite known how to ask. On the third day, a complication arrived. His name was Vernon Hale, and he rode onto Marcella's property at midday with the confident manner of a man who expected property to arrange itself according to his preferences. Vernon Hale was 42 years old, broad-shouldered, prosperous in the blunt cattle-baron fashion that this part of Texas produced with reliable frequency. He had been trying to buy Marcella's 40 acres since Thomas was barely cold in the ground, and his interest in the land was as transparent as glass and as relentless as weather. He took in the sight of Jasper working the fence line, and then he took in the sight of Marcella standing nearby with a water pail, and his expression underwent a rapid recalculation. "Mrs. Ford," he said, tipping his hat in a gesture that was more territorial than courteous. "I was not aware you had hired on help." "Mr. Hale," Marcella said. "Mr. Boone is a neighbor doing a neighborly thing. What brings you out?" Vernon dismounted with the ease of a heavy man long used to horses and came to stand within the particular proximity that men like him used to make a point. "I wanted to make another offer on the eastern parcel," he said. "I believe I have been exceedingly patient, and I think it is time you considered seriously what I am prepared to pay." "I have considered it," Marcella said. "My answer is still no." Vernon's eyes slid to Jasper, who had stopped working and was watching the exchange with the still, focused attention of a man who was calculating distance and probability, without appearing to do so. "Perhaps," Vernon said, "with someone to help you see reason, Mr. Hale." Jasper's voice was quiet, but it carried. He had set down his post driver and was walking toward them with the unhurried pace of a man who was very confident about where he was going. "I believe Mrs. Ford has given you her answer." Vernon turned to him. There was a moment in which the two men occupied the same contested air, and the outcome was genuinely uncertain, because Vernon Hale was not accustomed to obstacles, and Jasper Boone was not the kind of man who folded. Vernon Hale said, finally, "You would do well to mind your own affairs, Boone." "This fence is my affair," Jasper said simply. "And anything that happens on this side of it." The words were careful. Technically, they referred to the fencing work, but they meant something larger, and everyone present understood that, and Vernon Hale's jaw tightened visibly before he remounted his horse and rode away with the rigid dignity of a man who has been bested and knows it and has not finished being angry about it. Marcella watched him go. When the sound of hoofbeats had faded, she let out a long, controlled breath. "He has been trying to get this land for 7 months, she said. "I know," Jasper said. She looked at him. "How do you know?" "Don Agustin told me," he said. "He has been worried about you." He paused. "So have I." She did not know what to do with that. She took the safer path. "His offer is not unreasonable financially. The problem is that he would drain the creek for his cattle within a season and it would be gone. The creek feeds 3 other properties downstream." Jasper nodded slowly. "Including Don Agustin's." "Exactly." She met his eyes. "So I'm not just being sentimental. There is a reason." "There is always a reason with you," he said, and the way he said it was not a criticism. It was something closer to admiration. On the 4th day, the fence was done. Jasper stood back and looked at the new line of tight-stretched wire and solid posts with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had made something right. Marcella stood beside him and felt, with a peculiar clarity, that she was in significant trouble. Not the Vernon Hale kind of trouble, the other kind. She said, because she was honest in the way that only people who have lived through loss tend to be, "Why did you bring 2 dishes to the potluck, Jasper?" He did not pretend to misunderstand. He turned and looked at her with those direct brown eyes and said, "Because I had been watching you hold yourself together for 4 months with no help from anyone worth mentioning, and I thought the last thing you needed was to walk into that hall and feel like you had failed at something." "You could not have known I would forget," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I thought it was possible, and I thought it was better to have an extra dish than to have you turn around and walk out of somewhere you had every right to be." The honesty of that hit her somewhere deep and central, the care in it. The specific, particular attention it implied, not the grand, sweeping kind of attention that was really just desire dressing itself up, but the small, deliberate kind that required actually knowing someone. "That was a kind thing," she said. "I did not do it to be kind," he said, and then stopped, as though he had not intended to say quite that much. She waited. He looked at the fence line. He looked at the sky, which was that specific shade of late afternoon blue that appears over Texas in the spring and makes everything seem possible. Then he looked at her. "I did it because you matter to me," he said. "I recognize that is something I do not have a right to say yet. But it is true, and I am not a man who does well with dishonesty." Marcella stood very still. Her heart was doing something loud and complicated. She thought about Thomas, about the guilt and the grief and the way love felt like a betrayal when it arrived too soon after loss. She thought about the dark past she was still navigating, the debts paid and unpaid, the loneliness that had become so familiar it felt like a permanent resident. She thought about what it would mean to open herself to the possibility of being known again. She said, very carefully, "I am not in a place to make any promises, Jasper." "I am not asking for promises," he said. "I'm just asking if I can keep bringing you lunch sometimes." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "The cornbread will need to be better." He blinked. And then he laughed, a real laugh, startled and open, and she decided then that the sound of Jasper Boone laughing was one of the better things she had heard in a considerable time. May arrived with the specific heat that the Texas Hill Country delivered like a promise, warm mornings that became genuinely hot afternoons, the creek running clear over limestone, the live oaks leafed out fully in their gray-green way. Marcella's kitchen garden came up well that spring, better than the previous year, and she found herself taking a proprietary pleasure in it that surprised her. She had not cared about the garden last year. She had tended it mechanically, because the alternative was letting it die, and she was not willing to let one more thing die. This year she cared. This year she noticed the first tomatoes forming and felt something that was not quite happiness but was in the right neighborhood. Jasper came twice a week now. The pretexts were honest ones. He needed to check his fence line on the shared boundary. He had extra seed corn. He was passing by and wondered if she needed anything from town. The pretexts were also transparent, and both of them were aware of this, and both of them had tacitly agreed to pretend otherwise, because the pretexts allowed for something to develop at a pace that felt manageable. He had, in fact, improved the cornbread significantly. What Marcella was slowly learning about Jasper Boone: he had been briefly married many years ago before the war. His wife's name had been Alina. She had died in childbirth during his second year of service, and the child, a son, had not survived either. He told Marcella this on a warm Tuesday afternoon when they were sitting on her porch after he had helped her repair a section of her henhouse that a skunk had excavated. And the context was a conversation about grief, which they had arrived at naturally and without forcing. He told it quietly, without drama, but she heard the cost of it in his voice, the particular tone that loss produces in people who have carried it long enough for it to become structural. "I am sorry," she said, which was inadequate and true simultaneously. "Alina was a fine woman," he said. "She deserved a great deal better than the hand she was dealt." He paused. "After her, I did not think I would feel that particular kind of regard for anyone again." He said this as a simple statement of prior belief, making no claims about the present, but the present had a weight to it that she did not miss. She told him, in turn, about Thomas, about the ice storm and the gully and the long gray months that followed, about the specific cruelty of grief that made even simple tasks feel impossible, so that making a pot of coffee became a negotiation with despair, and yet life continued to require pots of coffee, and somehow that was how you went on, not by healing but by making coffee anyway. "Yes," he said when she said that, just yes. Like a man who had been to that same place and recognized the topography. There was a night in late May when a spring storm rolled in fast from the southwest, with the particular violence that made Texas weather its own category of experience. Lightning walked across the hills in bright, terrible steps, and the thunder followed so closely it was more vibration than sound. Marcella was not afraid of storms, generally, but this one had a malevolent quality that she could not entirely rationalize away, and she was standing at her window watching the creek rise when she heard hoofbeats on her lane. Jasper came to the door soaked through, rain streaming from the brim of his hat, his horse tethered quickly under the lean-to at the side of the house. "Creek is about to overflow," he said. "You need to move your animals to high ground." They worked for 40 minutes in the rain, moving her small stock, 2 goats, 8 chickens, a mule named Abraham to the higher ground behind the house, and then securing what loose things could be secured and letting what could not be secured simply be lost. By the time the creek crested and spread and the rain began to ease, they were both soaked to the bone and standing on her porch breathing hard. She opened the door and went inside, and he followed, and neither of them made a formal decision about it. She lit the lamp. She put water on for coffee. He took off his soaked coat and hat and hung them on the peg by the door that had been Thomas's peg, and she noticed him hesitate fractionally before doing so, and then do it anyway. They sat at her kitchen table with coffee and the sound of rain on the roof and talked for 3 hours. They talked about the war, about Reconstruction, about what Texas had been like coming out of it, all that displaced violence looking for new containers. They talked about the injustice of it, the way the freedmen were being squeezed out of land and opportunity by men who had simply replaced one set of arguments with another, and both of them were angry about it in the specific way of people who had grown up in the middle of that conflict and come out of it without illusions. They talked about what they hoped for. Jasper talked about wanting to build the Callaway spread into something that would last, something that had purpose beyond profit. Marcella talked about the creek, about the downstream properties it fed, about the idea she had been developing, tentatively, of organizing the properties along the creek into some kind of collective water agreement that would protect all of them against men like Vernon Hale. Jasper put his coffee cup down and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not admiration exactly, though that was present. Something more fundamental, like recognition. "You should do that," he said. "It would take someone with legal knowledge to draw up the agreement," she said. "There is a lawyer in San Marcos," he said. "His name is Horace Pemberton. He has a reputation for property law. I could ride down with you." She looked at him. "You have thought about this." "I have thought about a great deal of things regarding your situation," he said, and again there was that quality of contained honesty, the sense of a larger feeling held carefully within its appropriate limits. "You have more allies than you realize, Marcella." It was the first time he had used her given name. He seemed to notice it at the same moment she did, because something flickered in his eyes, not apology exactly, but acknowledgement. She said, quietly, "Jasper," just his name. But the way she said it held everything she was not yet prepared to say in full sentences. The rain had gentled to a steady pour. The lamp made the kitchen warm and amber. Outside, the creek ran high and urgent over its banks, and somewhere one of her goats made an offended noise from the high ground where they had been temporarily stationed. He left before midnight when the rain had eased enough for safe riding, and she stood on the porch and watched him go, and then stood there alone for a few minutes more, looking at the washed clean sky where the storm was rolling east and the stars were beginning to reappear, and she thought, "This is what it feels like to be alive. Not healed, not repaired, but alive." June brought heat and the beginning of complications that Marcella could not have anticipated. The first complication arrived in the person of a man named Calvin Boone, who rode into Redemption Creek on a Wednesday and asked at the general store where his brother Jasper was living. Marcella heard about this before Jasper did, because she happened to be at the store buying salt and sugar when Calvin came through the door, and she heard him asking, and something in the set of his face, something closed and hard-edged and faintly damaged, made her pay attention. Calvin Boone was 2 years younger than Jasper and looked like him in the way that brothers do, the same basic structure of bone and brow, but where Jasper's expression was open and direct, Calvin's was guarded in a way that spoke of either pain or manipulation, and at that moment Marcella could not tell which. She did not introduce herself. She listened to him get the directions to the Callaway spread, watched him leave, and then went directly to Jasper's property at a pace that was not quite a run. She found him in his barn working on a harness. When she told him, his hands went still. "Calvin," he said, and his voice was not happy. "He came looking for you," she said. "He should be riding out here within the hour. I thought you should know first." He looked at her with a gratitude that went deeper than the immediate situation, and she understood that she had done something significant by coming to warn him, that she had taken a position on the side of his welfare without asking for explanation, and that this mattered to him enormously. "Calvin is my brother," he said. "We parted badly. I left Tennessee without. There are things between us that I have not resolved." "You do not have to tell me," she said. "I want to tell you," he said and paused. "He lost money in a land deal several years ago. He believed I could have prevented it. He was partly right. I was in the middle of my own grief about a leaner, and I was not paying enough attention to the people around me, and by the time I noticed what was happening, the money was gone." He stopped. "He has not forgiven me. I'm not certain he is wrong to withhold forgiveness." "What does he want now?" she asked. "That is what I am wondering," Jasper said. Calvin arrived 40 minutes later. The two brothers faced each other in the yard with the specific stiffness of men who have things to say that their upbringing has not fully equipped them to say. Marcella stayed. Not because she inserted herself into their private business, but because Jasper, when he noticed her preparing to make a discreet exit, had said quietly, "Stay," and she had recognized in that single word a request for something steady to hold to. Calvin was surprised to find her there. He assessed her with a quick, intelligent scan that told her he was more perceptive than he looked. "You have settled in well," Calvin said to Jasper, and the sentence had edges on it. "I have worked for it," Jasper said. "I came because Ma's property in Tennessee is going to tax auction in September," Calvin said. "If neither of us does anything about it, it will be gone." He paused. "I cannot afford to buy it back alone." I thought he stopped. Something in his expression shifted, became slightly less armored. "I thought maybe together we could." The silence that followed was considerable. Marcella watched Jasper process this. She watched him weigh the cost and the history and the thing his brother was not saying directly, which was that he had come asking for help, which for a man like Calvin Boone was itself a form of extraordinary effort. Jasper said, "How much?" Calvin named a figure that was large but not insurmountable. Jasper was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I will need to see the tax notice, and I will need to know that we are square, Calvin. Not because the past did not happen, but because I cannot go forward carrying it like a stone, and neither can you." Calvin looked at the ground. Then he looked at his brother. Then he said in the stiff, difficult tone of a man who has not apologized in so long the muscle has gone unused, "You should have told me about a leaner, about how bad it was. I might have paid better attention myself." Jasper said, "I know. I am sorry I took my losses out on you," Calvin said. The words came out roughly, like something being dragged through a narrow space, but they came out. Jasper crossed the yard and extended his hand. Calvin took it and then did what men from Virginia do instead of embracing, held the handshake for an extra beat and looked away, which was the same thing. That evening, Jasper came to Marcella's porch with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her and said, "I have spent 3 years being a man with no family. I had almost convinced myself I preferred it." "Almost," she noted. "Almost," he agreed. "Family is complicated," she said. "Mine certainly was. My father believed that love required constant correction. Eventually, I ran out of desire to be corrected." "Is that why you married Thomas? To get clear of your father?" The question was direct enough that it startled her. She thought about it honestly rather than defensively. "Partly," she admitted. "Though I did love him, they are not mutually exclusive motivations." She looked at him. "Do you always ask the uncomfortable question?" "Only with people I think can handle the answer," he said. She let that sit for a moment. Then, "Yes, I think I do all right with uncomfortable questions." "I know," he said, and she felt again that specific warmth that was becoming increasingly hard to pretend she did not feel. Calvin stayed in Redemption Creek for a week. He was a more complicated man than she had initially assessed, capable of both the hard-edged bitterness she had first read and a dry, sardonic humor that emerged once he relaxed, and she could see Jasper in him in a way that made her revise her understanding of both of them. The brothers reached some kind of working accommodation, not a full reconciliation, that would require more time and more conversations, but the beginning of one. Jasper agreed to contribute to the Tennessee property, not to live there, but to prevent the final severance of the family's connection to a place that had been home once and remained, apparently, significant even to men who had left it under difficult circumstances. When Calvin rode out, he shook Marcella's hand and said, with only a small amount of irony, "He has chosen well." which was presumptuous and also kind, and which she filed away to think about later. In July, Vernon Hale made his move. It was not the direct purchase offer. That approach had failed repeatedly, and even Vernon's considerable persistence had its limits. Instead, he came to Marcella with a surveyor's report that claimed her northern fence line was 8 feet over the legal property boundary, which meant that a portion of the fence Jasper had helped her build was, according to this report, on land that Vernon claimed was either his or subject to dispute. The claim was almost certainly false, produced by a surveyor whose work was influenced by Vernon's money rather than the actual land markers. But legal disputes in 1884 Texas required engagement with the legal system, which required time and money and sophistication that not everyone had in equal measure. What Marcella had was stubbornness and a growing anger at the forces that spent their energy trying to push women alone on their land off that land. She rode to San Marcos with Jasper on a Tuesday morning in late July. The ride took most of the day, the two of them side by side on the limestone road with the cedar-studded hills rolling past, and it had an inadvertently quality of something more than a legal errand, because hours on horseback together did not lend themselves to anything except honest conversation. She told him about her father's beatings. She had not planned to tell him. The words came out simply in the context of a conversation about the ways authority could be misused, and once said they could not be unsaid, and she felt the familiar complicated aftermath of disclosure, the vulnerability and the slight relief and the waiting to see how it landed. He did not make it about him. He did not reassure her excessively or fix it with words or look at her with the pity that was worse than silence. He said after a moment, "I am glad you got out." That was all. 4 words, and they were exactly enough. Horace Pemberton was a thin, sharp-eyed lawyer in his 50s with a reputation for property law and a decided lack of patience for bad-faith claims. He looked at Vernon Hale's surveyor report for approximately 4 minutes, asked Marcella a series of precise questions about the original land grant documentation, and then delivered his opinion in the way of a man who had seen this kind of thing before and was tired of it. "This report is fabricated," he said. "Not incompetently, but fabricated. I can see 3 specific discrepancies with the original survey markers that would have required deliberate error to produce." He paused. "The question is how much you want to spend proving that." "What are my options?" Marcella asked. He laid them out with precise efficiency. She could contest the claim legally, which would cost money and time. She could ignore it, which carried its own risks. Or, and here he leaned forward slightly, she could take the initiative. "Your creek," he said. "You mentioned the water rights. Have they ever been formally recorded?" "Informally understood," she said. "There is the problem," he said. "An informal understanding is not worth the breath it takes to state it. If you wanted, you could formalize those water rights for every property on that creek before Hale makes a move. If the water rights are recorded and distributed legally, his ability to drain the creek is gone regardless of whether he gets your land." Marcella looked at Jasper. He was looking at Pemberton with an expression of engaged attention. "That is what she has been planning," Jasper said. "Then let us do it properly," Pemberton said. They spent 3 hours in Pemberton's office that afternoon. They left with a plan, a timeline, and several documents that needed signatures from the downstream property owners. On the ride home, which they made slower because the horses were tired and neither of them was in any hurry, the quality of the air between them had changed. Something had been decided, not about the water rights, though that too, but about something larger. "You are not alone in this," Jasper said at one point when the road crested a hill and the hill country spread out before them in the long golden light of late afternoon. "No," she said. "I have noticed that. Marcella." He pulled his horse to a halt and she pulled hers beside him, and they sat there on the hilltop with the world spread out below them. "I am aware that I have been circling around something for several months without arriving at it. I think you are aware of it too." She said nothing. She waited. "I would like to come calling on you properly," he said. not as a neighbor doing a neighborly thing, not with pretexts about fencing and seed corn. He met her eyes. "I would like to come because you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in a very long time, and I would like the chance to show you that my regard for you is both serious and entirely honorable." The light was extraordinary on the hills. The cedar and live oak threw long purple shadows. Somewhere down in the valley, a mockingbird was running through its repertoire of other birds' songs. Marcella looked at this man who had brought 2 dishes to a potluck, who had fixed her fence and her wheel and faced down Vernon Hale, who had asked the uncomfortable question and listened to her disclosure without flinching, who had been honest about his grief and his failures and his family in the specific way that people are honest when they have nothing to hide. She said, "I am not entirely over grieving Thomas." "I would not expect you to be," he said. "And I am not a woman who will be managed or directed or handled," she said. "I know that," he said. "I am counting on it. And I have strong opinions about the creek and the water rights in Vernon Hale, and I intend to act on all of them regardless of what anyone thinks. I have been aware of that since approximately our 3rd conversation," he said. "It is one of the things I most respect about you." She looked at him for a long moment. The hills were golden and vast, and the sky was doing that particular Texas evening thing where it went from blue to the specific shade of rose gold that made even hard country look like grace. "You may come calling," she said. "Properly," he smiled. It was not a triumphant smile. It was just happiness, plain and uncomplicated, the kind that belongs to people who have waited long enough for it to know what it is worth. August was the month of formalization, of documents and agreements, and the slow, careful building of 2 things simultaneously. The Water Rights Collective took shape across 6 weeks of rides and conversations, and 3 more trips to San Marcos. Don Agustin Reyes signed first, with the kind of calm certainty that comes from having worked this land for decades and knowing what it required. The 2 other downstream property owners, the Whitmore family and a German farmer named Heinrich Brauer, signed soon after. Jasper's property, being upstream of Marcella's but connected to the same watershed, was included in the agreement by his own request, and Pemberton incorporated his land into the protective framework as well. When the final document was filed with the county, Marcella stood in Pemberton's office and felt something release in her chest that she had not realized was clenched. Vernon Hale, when he received his legal notice of the water rights filing, was furious. He came to Marcella's property on a Thursday morning in August with his foreman, and a face that had gone the particular shade of red that extremely angry men of his temperament achieve when their plans have been dismantled. "You have made enemies," he said. "I have protected a creek," she said, standing on her porch with her hands on the rail and her back very straight. "If those are the same thing to you, that tells me everything I need to know about your priorities." "This is not finished," he said. "Legally, it is," she said. "You are welcome to speak to my lawyer in San Marcos if you disagree." Jasper appeared from around the side of the barn at that moment, unhurried, his presence simply there. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Vernon Hale looked between them, did the calculation, and rode away. He sold his property 14 months later and moved north. The creek ran undisturbed for generations after. The calling on was, as Marcella had insisted, done properly. He came on Sunday afternoons, sometimes with a basket from his own kitchen, always with his hat in his hand, and that quality of deliberate attention that she was beginning to understand was simply how he operated. They took walks along the creek. They sat on her porch through the long summer evenings with the cicadas making their enormous noise and the fireflies coming up out of the grass. They read to each other sometimes, from the books she kept on a shelf in the sitting room. History, poetry, one well-worn copy of a natural history of Texas that had belonged to Thomas, and which she had thought before she could not bear to open. She read it with Jasper. He told her more about Eleanor. She told him more about her father and about Kansas City, and about the specific texture of loneliness in this territory for a woman without family connections. They told each other the things that people tell each other when they are falling into something real and irreversible, the embarrassing things and the frightening things and the things that make them look small, because those are the things that test whether a person will stay. He stayed. She stayed. In September, he asked her to marry him. He asked her on a Tuesday evening in the kitchen, which was not romantic in the conventional sense but was, she thought, entirely appropriate for who they were. He had come to help her put up the last of the garden harvest, and they were standing at the kitchen table with rows of preserving jars when he said, with the directness that was his defining characteristic, "Marcella, I would like to ask you to be my wife, not because you need someone to protect your land or manage your affairs. You have demonstrated with considerable clarity that you can do both of those things yourself. But because I want to build a life with you and I cannot imagine building it with anyone else." She set down the jar she was holding. She looked at him. "I have to ask you something first," she said. "Ask anything," he said. "Are you asking because you love me," she said, "or because you love the idea of someone to not be alone with?" He was quiet for a moment in which she could see him really weighing the question rather than rushing to answer it. "Both," he said, "and I do not think they are separable. I love you, Marcella. Specifically, the way you stand on your porch when Vernon Hale shows up and your back goes straight as a fence post. The way you memorized every property line on this creek before you talked to the lawyer. The way you cried at the potluck and then made sure no one saw it." He paused. "I have loved you, I think, since the day I fixed your wheel in the dark." She said, "You have loved me since the wagon wheel." "I have," he said with no apology. She thought about all the reasons to be cautious. She thought about grief and timing and the complexity of starting over. She thought about the specific loneliness of the last 9 months and the equally specific warmth of the last 6. She thought about cornbread and church potlucks and a man who had brought 2 dishes to a supper because he would not let her feel small. "Yes," she said. He crossed the kitchen and took her hands in his, and looked at her the way that people look at each other when they have been honest about all the hard things and are choosing each other anyway. He kissed her then for the first time, gently and with the specific reverence of a man who understands that things of value require appropriate care, and she kissed him back with more certainty than she had felt about anything in a very long time. They were married on the first Saturday in October, 1884, in the Redemption Creek Methodist Church, by Pastor Elias Holt, who conducted the ceremony with the dignified warmth of a man who had been genuinely rooting for this outcome. The entire town came. Mrs. Hattie Prout brought a peach cobbler to the reception, which she presented with an expression that suggested she had always supported the match. Calvin Boone rode down from Tennessee for the wedding and stood beside his brother with the careful dignity of a man who was performing the emotional labor of approving something and finding, to his surprise, that it required less performance than anticipated. Don Agustin Reyes came in his Sunday best with his hat in his hand and his eyes bright, and he said to Marcella in Spanish, which she had been learning over the past year, "Thomas would be glad." And she held that for a moment and found that it was true and that the truth of it was not grief but something else, something that allowed the past and the present to exist in the same space without canceling each other out. Jasper wore a dark wool coat and a new hat and the expression of a man who cannot quite believe his luck and has decided to simply proceed in the direction of it anyway. He said his vows in a clear voice without stumbling, looking directly at Marcella as though there were nothing else in the building worth looking at. She wore a blue dress she had made herself from fabric that had been in her trunk for 2 years, waiting for an occasion she had not been sure would arrive. Her hair was pinned up, and there were small wildflowers from along the creek worked into it. She was 30 years old and had been widowed and had survived 7 months of gray loneliness and had fixed fences and filed legal papers and protected a creek and fallen in love with a man who understood her. And she felt, standing in that church before her community with her hand in Jasper Boone's, extraordinarily and simply glad. The winter of 1884 to 1885 was the winter of learning each other at close range, which is both the best and most demanding version of marriage. They combined their households, practically speaking, choosing to live on Marcella's homestead because her land was better watered, and because her garden was established, and because neither of them was particularly sentimental about which physical structure they occupied, while leasing the Callaway spread to a young family named Kessler who had recently arrived from Missouri and needed a start. The income from the lease supplemented the cattle operation and provided a more stable financial foundation than either of them had managed alone. Jasper brought his books and his tools and the large cast-iron skillet that had been his grandmother's, and a small wooden box of his own that he set on the mantel without explanation, and that she did not ask about. She understood the mantle of private grief. They worked well together. That, she discovered, was one of the important things that no one told you about. Whether the person you loved was someone you could stand beside all day doing ordinary work without it becoming a friction. Some people were not suited to proximity. They needed distance to remain lovable. Jasper was not that kind of person. He was better up close, more himself, more present. He was also, as she discovered with a pleasure she had not anticipated, funny. Not performing funny, not the desperate social humor of people who need to be entertaining, but quiet, dry, observational funny that appeared at completely unexpected moments and consistently caught her off guard. She would be doing something entirely ordinary, and he would say something in that understated way of his, and she would laugh before she was prepared to, which was apparently his particular talent. She was, she supposed, easier to love from a certain distance. Up close, she was demanding about order and persistent about her opinions and occasionally abrupt with her emotional honesty. He seemed to find none of this objectionable. He seemed to find most of it interesting, in the way of someone who is genuinely curious about the person they are with rather than simply invested in a flattering version of them. They argued 4 times that winter. Genuinely argued, with raised voices and the particular stubbornness that 2 opinionated people produce when they care enough about something to fight over it. Once about money, once about a decision he made about the cattle without consulting her, once about something too small to fully reconstruct in the aftermath, and once about Calvin, who had written asking for a loan that Jasper felt obligated to provide, and that Marcella felt required more careful consideration of whether it would actually help Calvin or simply delay the harder reckoning he needed to reach on his own. That last argument was the most illuminating, because they had both been partly right, and working through to the place where they could acknowledge that took 2 long evenings and a significant amount of honest discomfort. They reached an agreement, a partial amount, with conditions, and a letter from both of them to Calvin that said the money came with their genuine concern for his welfare and a shared hope that he would find his footing. Calvin wrote back 3 months later to say the money had helped, and the letter had said things he needed to hear. In the spring of 1885, Marcella discovered she was pregnant. She told Jasper on a Tuesday morning, sitting across the kitchen table with the coffee between them, the way she told him most important things, directly and without ceremony. He was quiet for so long that she began to wonder if she had miscalculated his response, if this was the thing that would reveal some hidden capacity for alarm or withdrawal that she had not previously observed. Then she saw that his eyes were wet. He reached across the table and took her hand and said, "Are you well? Are you frightened?" "Both," she said honestly. "I am 31 years old and I have not done this before, and it is very possible that everything will be fine and also very possible that it will not." "I know," he said. He held her hand steadier. "I will be here, whatever happens." She heard what he was not saying, Eleanor, the child who had not survived. The particular terror of a man who had already lost this thing and was being asked to hope for it again. She said, "I know that this is not a straightforward thing for you either." He looked at her. "Nothing about the best things is straightforward," he said. That does not make me any less grateful. She went to see the doctor in Redemption Creek, a practical man named Dr. Callum Pierce, who had delivered a good portion of the town, and who told her she was healthy and strong, and that he foresaw no particular complications, but that she should eat well and rest more than she was probably inclined to. She ate well. She did not rest more than she was inclined to, because she was not inclined to rest very much, but she made small concessions, and Jasper made quiet accommodations, and the spring passed into summer with the garden coming up again and the cattle doing well and the creek running clear, and the water rights collective functioning exactly as intended. In November of 1885, their son was born. They named him Thomas Jasper Boone. Thomas for the man who had first loved this land and this woman and who deserved to be remembered. Jasper for the man who would raise him, and Boone because that was what they were now. He was born healthy and loud, and with a remarkable amount of dark hair for a newborn, and he announced his arrival with the full-throated indignation of someone who had been perfectly comfortable and saw no reason for the current disruption. Dr. Pierce delivered him without incident. Jasper sat in the kitchen through the long labor with his hands flat on the table and his jaw set, and the particular focused stillness of a man holding himself together by main force. And when Pierce opened the door and told him he had a son, he put his face in his hands for a moment that was entirely private and then stood up and went to his wife. She was exhausted and radiant in the specific way of women who have just accomplished something extraordinary. The baby was in her arms, frowning at the indignity of the world. "Thomas Jasper," she said when he sat on the edge of the bed. "Thomas Jasper," he agreed. He put one careful hand on the baby's head. He looked at Marcella. She reached up and touched his face, which was wet. Neither of them said anything for a while because there was nothing that needed saying. They had come through grief and distance and loneliness and bad faith surveys and storm-flooded creeks and hard winters, and the whole enormous complicated business of learning to belong to each other. And here they were, on the other side of all of it, in a kitchen house on 40 acres by a creek in the Texas Hill Country, with a son in the lamplight who had not yet been given any reasons not to trust the world. Don Agustin Reyes came the next morning and held young Thomas and said something in Spanish that Marcella had to ask him to repeat slowly. He said it again. "This child is born beside good water. This is a fine beginning." She thought he was right about both things. The years that followed were full in the way that good lives are full. Not without hardship, because the country did not permit that luxury. The droughts and the cattle prices and the inevitable grinding demands of land and weather and commerce. But full, purposeful, rich with the specific texture of days that are lived rather than merely endured. Young Thomas grew to be a boy who was quiet and observant like his father and determined, and sharp-tongued like his mother and deeply interested in horses, which was a practical and appropriate passion for a boy growing up in this place and time. He was followed, 3 years later, by a daughter they named Eleanor Grace, after Jasper's first wife, and for the quality of grace that Marcella had decided, she wanted her daughter to grow up understanding as strength rather than submission. Eleanor was loud and opinionated and absolutely fearless, which made her parents simultaneously proud and exhausted in the particular way that fearless daughters produce in the people who love them. 2 years after Eleanor came another son, James Henry Boone, who arrived with far less drama than either of his siblings, and immediately demonstrated a placid, sunny temperament that Marcella found both delightful and faintly suspicious, having not previously encountered it in the immediate family. Calvin Boone came to Texas in 1888 and settled on a small spread 2 miles west of Redemption Creek, having finally sold the Tennessee property when the financial burden of holding it outweighed the emotional cost of releasing it. He was a different man from the one who had ridden in during that first summer, not transformed, because people are not transformed easily, but shifted, as though the years had worn away some of the harder outer layer and revealed someone more navigable underneath. He was Uncle Calvin to all three children, who adored him in the specific way that children adore adults who take them seriously and occasionally say mildly inappropriate things that their parents pretend not to hear. Don Agustin Reyes died in the winter of 1889, peacefully, in his own bed, at the age of 73. He had no children of his own and had made his wishes clear before his death. His property was to go to the Creek Collective, to be held and maintained as a shared resource. Marcella managed the transition with Pemberton's help, and Don Agustin's fields continued to be tended by the Kessler family, who leased the land from the collective and treated it with the careful respect it deserved. At the memorial service, Marcella spoke about him in both English and Spanish, which by 1889 she spoke with functional fluency, and she said that he had taught her that land was not something you owned, but something you were briefly entrusted with, and that good stewardship was both a practical necessity and a kind of gratitude. She said this in a voice that did not break until the very last sentence, and then broke cleanly and quickly and without apology, and Jasper put his hand at the small of her back and she leaned into it fractionally, which was the vocabulary of their marriage. Small, constant, sufficient. The Water Rights Collective she had organized in 1884 became a template. In 1890, Pemberton wrote to tell her that 2 other communities in the Hill Country had used their agreement as a model for similar ones. She read the letter twice and then set it on the kitchen table and said to Jasper, who was sitting across from her reading the San Antonio newspaper, "Apparently the thing I did worked somewhere else." He looked up. "Of course it did," he said, as though this required no surprise. She threw a dish towel at him. He caught it and smiled. Redemption Creek itself grew through the 1880s and into the 1890s. A school building replaced the one-room arrangement that had served the earliest settlers. A telegraph line came through in 1887. The railroad reached a town 15 miles east in 1891, which changed everything about commerce and communication without changing what Marcella loved about this particular stretch of creek and limestone. The Boone property remained, as she had told Jasper it would in their very first real conversation about it, hers, not defensively, not as a claim against the world. Simply as a fact. This is where she was, this is what she had built, this is where Thomas and Eleanor and James would grow up knowing the specific quality of water over limestone and the particular generosity of a man who brought 2 dishes to a church potluck. On a Sunday in the spring of 1892, the Redemption Creek Methodist Church held its annual potluck supper. The hall was full of exactly the sort of noise that community functions produce: children running, fiddle music, the particular competitive warmth of women who take their cooking seriously. The table was loaded with dishes that represented the accumulated culinary traditions of a dozen different family histories. German sauerkraut alongside Southern cornbread, alongside the preserved goods and pie traditions that came from Missouri and Tennessee and Virginia. Marcella Ford Boone arrived with a cast-iron pot of her grandmother's bean soup and a pan of the cornbread that she had finally, over 8 years of practice, learned to make the way Jasper's grandmother made it, which was the way he still liked it best. Jasper Boone arrived beside her. He had not brought 2 dishes. There was no need. There would never be a need again, not because she would never again forget something or lose something or stand empty-handed before a room full of people who had what she did not, but because she was not standing alone anymore, and because the man beside her was the kind of person who would notice, and who would always, in whatever way the situation required, make sure she did not feel small. Mrs. Hattie Prout, who was 71 now and had considerably softened over the years in the way that strong-willed women sometimes soften when they observe that life is more various than their initial assessments allowed, saw them come through the door together with their children and their food, and the particular ease of people who had chosen each other through the full difficult knowledge of what choosing entailed, and she said to Ruth Ellen Graves beside her, "They look well." Ruth Ellen, who had always been more perceptive than she let on, said quietly, "They look happy." This was true. They were happy, in the specific, hard-won way of people who have earned it, not by having been spared the hard things, but by having gone through them together and come out the other side with their trust intact, and their eyes open and their hands still, gratefully, reaching for each other. Young Thomas, who was 6 years old and extremely earnest, carried his mother's cornbread pan the entire way from the door to the table without dropping it once, which he had been promised he was old enough to do, and which he accomplished with the focused determination of his mother's particular variety of stubbornness and his father's quiet certainty. He set it on the table and looked up at his parents for confirmation. "Well done," Jasper said. Thomas straightened with the specific satisfaction of a boy who has been seen. Eleanor, 4 years old and constitutionally incapable of doing anything the straightforward way, had acquired 3 wildflowers on the walk from the wagon to the church door and was attempting to present them to whoever she encountered first. She found Clara Whitmore's daughter, who was 5 and receptive to wildflowers, and an alliance was immediately struck. James, 2 years old and conducted everywhere in Jasper's arms, regarded the hall with the serene interest of someone who found the world reliably entertaining and had no immediate concerns about it. The fiddle started up. Someone opened the windows to let in the spring air. The long table filled with food, and the room filled with voices, and the light through the windows was the particular golden color that late afternoon in the Texas Hill Country produces in spring, the color that makes even ordinary things look as though they have been touched by something larger than themselves. Marcella found Jasper at her elbow, as he so often was. She said low enough that only he could hear, "Do you remember the first time we were in this hall together? You were about to walk out," he said. "You stopped me," she said, "with a dish of chili and a careful lie." "It was extra chili," he said. "I always made extra." She looked at him with the expression she had developed over 8 years of mornings and evenings and arguments and laughter and grief and hard work and all the ordinary extraordinary business of a life shared, an expression that did not require any particular label because they both knew what it meant. "Thank you," she said, "for that day. For every day after," he said. He took her hand, briefly, in the way of a man who has done it 10,000 times and will do it 10,000 more. And then Eleanor arrived at full speed, having apparently lost the wildflower alliance to a crisis involving a spilled cup. And James, from his secure position in the air, pointed at something across the room with the absolute authority of a 2-year-old. And Thomas appeared from nowhere to report that he had already eaten 2 biscuits from the table before grace was said, and felt it was important to confess this, and the particular beautiful noise of their life swallowed everything else. Outside, through the open church windows, the creek ran over its limestone bed the way it had run before any of them arrived and would run long after, carrying the meltwater of the spring hills down through the cedar and the rock and out into the broad, flat country below. The water rights had held. The creek had not been drained. 4 properties downstream drew from it as they always had, and in the summer children swam in it, and in the autumn the deer came to it at dusk, and in all weathers it made that particular sound of moving water over stone that is one of the most ancient sounds in the world and which means, simply, that something worth protecting has been protected. Redemption Creek, Texas. Population now just over 600 souls and growing. A place built out of hard limestone and hard weather, and the particular stubbornness of people who had come looking for something solid and had found, if not always what they were looking for, something worth staying for. Among them, a woman named Marcella Ford Boone, who had arrived here as someone's wife and become, entirely on her own terms herself. And a man named Jasper Boone, who had arrived here carrying his grief and his history and his grandmother's recipe for chili, and who had, on a spring afternoon in the year of their Lord 1884, walked through the side door of a church hall with a dish in each hand, and changed the entire direction of two lives by the simple, extraordinary act of making sure a woman he loved did not have to stand alone. The story of how it began was simple enough. Every woman at the church potluck had brought a dish except her, and he had brought two, so she would not feel it. The story of everything that followed was considerably more complicated and more beautiful and more true, the way that all the best stories are. They stayed in Redemption Creek. The children grew. The creek ran. The garden came up every spring with the particular reliability of things properly tended. And on Sunday mornings, when the bell rang and the congregation gathered and the long table was laid, and the hall filled with all the ordinary abundance of a community that had survived itself, Jasper Boone and Marcella Ford Boone walked through the door together, their hands sometimes touching, their children sometimes ahead of them and sometimes behind, their lives full to the measure of what two honest and determined people could build when they chose each other in full knowledge of the cost and the worth. Which is to say, full enough, more than enough to last.